Jake Morrison looked out the window of the spaceship and saw a dying world. The planet below had brown patches where green should be. Rivers looked like dark lines cutting through empty land. Cities sparkled like diamonds, but the spaces between them were bare and lifeless. "Hard to believe they built all that technology," said Pete Williams, standing next to him. Pete was young and eager. Fresh out of agricultural school on Earth, this was his first mission to another world. Jake nodded. The Zephyrians were incredible builders. Their cities floated above the ground using some kind of energy field. Their ships moved faster than anything humans had ever built. But their planet was starving. Darlisa Carter walked into the viewing room carrying a tablet full of data. She had been studying everything Earth scientists knew about this world. The soil samples they had received months ago told a sad story. The ground was tired and empty, drained of everything plants needed to grow. "The atmospheric readings are stable," Lisa said, looking at her tablet. "We can breathe their air with minor filters. But the soil situation is worse than we thought." The mission had taken 3 years to plan. First contact with the Zephyrians had happened when one of their scout ships had mechanical problems near Earth's moon. Human engineers had helped fix their ship, and that small act of kindness had opened the door to friendship between two species. The Zephyrians had a problem they could not solve. Their world was dying and they did not know how to save it. Their machines could do amazing things, but they could not make food grow in dead soil. They had asked Earth for help, specifically requesting agricultural experts. Captain Morrison, too. "The bridge," came a voice over the ship's communication system. Jake left the viewing room and walked through the corridors of their ship. The Horizon's Edge. It was not as fancy as Zephyrian technology, but it was reliable and had brought them safely across the galaxy. On the bridge, Communications Officer Amy Johnson was talking to the Zephyrian ship. Their vessel looked like a crystal that had been stretched into the shape of a needle. It moved without any visible engines, sliding through space as if the laws of physics bent around it. "They're confirming landing coordinates," Amy said. "Hi. Cultivator Xylan wants to meet us at the surface camp." Jake had read about Xylan during the journey. The Zephyrian leader was considered one of their greatest agricultural theorists. He had written thousands of papers about growing food using technology. But none of his theories had worked on their dying world. The two ships descended through the atmosphere together. Jake watched the landscape grow larger and more detailed. What had looked like brown patches from space were actually vast areas of cracked earth. Here and there, he could see the remains of what had once been farms. Old irrigation channels cut across the land like scars. Empty and dry. The landing site was in what the Zephyrians called the Central Growing Zone. It had once been the most productive farming area on their planet. Now it looked like a desert made of broken dirt. The Zephyrian ship landed first, settling onto the ground without making a sound. Jake watched as structures began to rise from the earth around it. The Zephyrians could make buildings by rearranging atoms in the soil. Within minutes, they had created a small city of silver towers and connecting bridges. The Horizon's Edge landed nearby with a rumble of engines and a cloud of dust. The human crew began unloading their equipment the old-fashioned way, carrying boxes and setting up prefabricated shelters. Their camp looked rough and simple next to the Zephyrian structures, but it was home. Lisa was one of the first to step onto the alien soil. She knelt down and picked up a handful of dirt, letting it run through her fingers. Pete and the other agricultural specialists watched her carefully. Her opinion would shape everything they did here. "It's not dead," she said finally. "It's just sleeping." High Cultivator Xylan approached their landing site wearing what looked like a second skin made of some transparent material. Through the translation device attached to his suit, his voice sounded like music mixed with the sound of wind chimes. "Welcome to our world, humans," Xylan said. "We are grateful for your assistance with our agricultural difficulties." Jake stepped forward to greet him. Xylan was tall and thin, with skin that looked like it was made of colored glass. His people were beautiful in an otherworldly way, but they seemed fragile compared to the sturdy humans. "We're honored to help," Jake said. "Our agricultural team is excited to work with your scientists. Xylan gestured toward Lisa, who was still examining the soil. Your specialist appears to be engaging in direct contact with the growing medium. Is this a standard analytical procedure? Lisa looked up from the dirt. I'm just getting a feel for what we're working with, she said. Sometimes you can learn more with your hands than with any machine. The Zephyrian leader took a step back. Physical contact with unprocessed soil is considered unhygienic by our standards. We prefer to maintain proper environmental barriers during all scientific procedures. Pete whispered to Lisa. They don't touch dirt? Apparently not, Lisa whispered back. Xylan led them on a tour of the Zephyrian facilities. Every surface was clean and smooth. Their agricultural laboratories looked like something from a science fiction movie, full of floating screens and devices that hummed with energy. Everything was designed to keep the operators separated from whatever they were. Stunning. Our molecular analyzers can determine soil composition down to individual atoms, Xylan explained proudly. Our atmospheric processors can adjust growing conditions to precise specifications. Our genetic modification chambers can enhance plant growth rates by 300%. Lisa nodded politely, but Jake could see she was not impressed. All this fancy equipment and the planet was still dying. That evening, both teams gathered for a welcome dinner. The Zephyrians served food that had been created by their machines, perfectly nutritious but bland and artificial tasting. The humans shared some of their supplies from Earth, simple foods that had been grown in real soil under a real sun. As the meal ended, Jake noticed something troubling. Several of the Zephyrians looked tired and their normally bright skin seemed dull. The youngest member of their team, a researcher named Zeth, was barely eating at all. Lisa noticed it too. She leaned over to Jake and spoke quietly. I think they're malnourished. Their artificial food isn't giving them what they need. Jake looked around at the advanced Zephyrian technology, then at the barren landscape visible through the windows. A species that could build floating cities and travel between stars was slowly starving because they had forgotten how to grow real food. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But already, Jake was beginning to understand that this mission would be more challenging than anyone had expected. The Zephyrians needed more than agricultural advice. They needed to remember something their ancestors had known but they had forgotten in their rush toward technological advancement outside the camp. The alien soil waited patiently for someone willing to get their hands dirty. The first week on the alien world was harder than anyone had expected. Lisa Carter stood in the Zephyrian laboratory watching their machines work. Lights flashed and screens showed endless streams of data, but no actual plants were growing anywhere. Hi. Cultivator Xylan moved between his devices like a conductor leading an orchestra. His long fingers danced over floating controls that responded to his touch with musical tones. Everything he did was precise and elegant, but it was not producing food. The molecular composition indicates optimal growing conditions, Xylan announced to his team. Nitrogen levels are at exactly 14.7%. Phosphorus content has been adjusted to 3.2%. All parameters are within theoretical maximums. Lisa watched a small plant in one of their growing chambers. It had been there for 3 days and was already turning yellow. The roots looked weak and the leaves were dropping off one by one. She had seen healthier plants growing in parking lot cracks back on Earth. Have you considered that maybe the theory is wrong? Lisa asked. The question made Xylan pause. His crystalline skin changed color slightly, shifting from blue to purple. Lisa was learning that this was how Zephyrians showed confusion or displeasure. The theory is based on comprehensive analysis of optimal plant nutrition, Xylan said. Our calculations cannot be incorrect. Pete Williams was working at a table nearby, examining soil samples under a simple microscope. It was basic equipment compared to the Zephyrian devices, but he was finding things their advanced scanners had missed. Lisa, come look at this, Pete called out. She walked over and peered into the microscope. The soil sample showed tiny structures that looked like sleeping seeds or dormant bacteria. They were so small that only the highest magnification could Reveal them. Those look like mycorrhizal fungi, Lisa said. They help plant roots absorb nutrients, but they're dormant. Can your molecular analyzers detect these? Pete asked. Xylan, the Zephyrian leader, floated over to their table. His environmental suit kept him from getting too close to the soil sample. Our scanners detect all chemical compositions. We have identified those microorganisms but classified them as contamination to be eliminated. Lisa stared at him. You've been sterilizing the soil? Of course, contamination interferes with optimal growing conditions. Those aren't contamination, Lisa said, trying to keep her voice calm. They're the reason plants can grow at all. You've, been killing the very thing that makes soil alive? The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside the laboratory. Through the transparent walls, they could see Dr. Ben Crawford stumbling as he walked back from the survey mission. Amy Johnson caught his arm to steady him. Ben, you okay? Amy asked. The young engineer shook his head as if trying to clear it. Just dizzy, haven't been sleeping well. But Lisa could see it was more than that. Ben's face was pale and he had dark circles under his eyes. She had seen the same signs in some of the Zephyrians over the past few days. That evening, the human medical officer ran tests on Ben and found exactly what Lisa had feared. Malnutrition was beginning to affect the entire team. The food supplies they had brought from Earth were running low, and the Zephyrian synthesized food was not providing everything human bodies needed. Even worse, the Zephyrians themselves were showing signs of serious nutritional deficiency. Their bright skin was becoming dull and several of them were moving more slowly than before. Young Zeth had started missing meals entirely. Captain Morrison called a meeting of both teams. The Zephyrian facilities could accommodate everyone, but the humans looked out of place among all the advanced technology. They sat on chairs that floated above the floor and spoke through translation devices that made their voices sound strange. We need to talk about the food situation, Morrison said. Our supplies won't last much longer, and the synthetic food isn't meeting everyone's nutritional needs. Xylan's skin shifted to a deeper purple. Our food production systems are operating at optimal efficiency. The nutritional content meets all theoretical requirements. But people are getting sick, Lisa said. Theory doesn't matter if it doesn't work in practice. Perhaps the problem is with biological adaptation rather than production methodology, Xylan suggested. Your species may require adjustment time to properly process optimized nutrition. Lisa felt her patience wearing thin. She had spent the week watching Xylan's team try the same failed approaches over and over. Their machines could analyze anything down to individual atoms, but they could not grow a single healthy plant. Maybe the problem is that you're trying to control everything instead of working with nature, she said. The laboratory fell silent. The Zephyrians looked at each other with expressions that were hard for humans to read. Finally, Xylan spoke. Working with nature is an outdated concept. We have evolved beyond such primitive dependencies. Our technology allows us to improve upon natural processes. Your technology has left your planet dying, Lisa said bluntly. Xylan's skin flashed bright red for a moment before returning to purple. Our planet faces challenges that require technological solutions. Physical interaction with growing mediums is inefficient and unsanitary. Advanced species do not engage in such activities. That night, Lisa could not sleep. She walked out of the human camp and stood at the edge of the growing area where Xylan's team had set up their latest experiment. Rows of small plants sat in perfectly climate-controlled chambers, each one receiving exactly the right amount of light, water, and nutrients according to their calculations. Every single plant was dying. Lisa knelt down and picked up a handful of the sterilized soil. It felt dead in her hands, like sand or dust. There was no life in it, no complexity, no mystery. It was exactly what the machines said it should be, and it could not support life. She made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would start her own garden. If the Zephyrians would not touch the soil, she would show them what human hands could accomplish. The next morning, Lisa approached Captain Morrison with her plan. I want to set up a demonstration plot outside the main camp, she said. Something small, maybe 50 meters square. Morrison looked skeptical. The Zephyrians aren't going to like it. They think hands-on farming is beneath them. Let them think. What they want, Lisa said. People are getting sick, Jake, both our people and theirs. Someone needs to grow real food, and their machines can't do it. Morrison nodded slowly. What do you need? Just Pete to help me, and permission to use one. Of the seed collections we brought from Earth, I'll handle the rest. That afternoon, Lisa and Pete walked to a spot about 200 meters from the main camp. The ground was typical of the area, cracked and lifeless looking. But Lisa had learned not to trust appearances on this world. They marked out their plot, using simple stakes and string. It looked ridiculously primitive compared to the Zephyrian facilities nearby. Through the transparent walls of the alien laboratory, Lisa could see Xylan and his team watching them with what looked like scientific curiosity mixed with disapproval. The humans are establishing a manual cultivation area, she heard one of the Zephyrians say through their translation device. Fascinating regression to pre-technological agricultural methods. Lisa smiled and kept working. She had brought seeds from Earth that had been specially selected for adaptability. Hardy beans that could grow in almost any soil, tough squash that could spread and protect the ground, fast-growing greens that could provide nutrition quickly, but, more importantly, she had brought something the Zephyrians had forgotten. She knew how to listen to the land, how to feel what the soil needed, how to work with nature instead of against it. As the sun set on their first day of real farming, Lisa looked at the small plot of disturbed earth. It did not look like much yet, but she could feel the potential waiting beneath the surface. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Lisa Carter woke up before dawn and walked out to her small garden plot. The twin suns of this alien world were just beginning to rise, casting strange purple shadows across the cracked ground. She knelt down and put her hands into the soil. She had been working for 3 days. The dirt felt different already. It was still hard and dry, but there was something alive stirring beneath the surface. Lisa had spent years learning to read soil with her fingers, and this ground was starting to wake up. Pete Williams joined her as she began the morning routine of checking moisture levels and adjusting the simple irrigation system they had built from spare parts. The Zephyrians had offered to let them use their advanced water distribution technology, but Lisa preferred to control the flow herself. Any sign of germination yet? Pete asked, crouching down beside a row where they had planted. Beans. Give it time, Lisa said. Plants know when conditions are right. We just have to be patient. Through the transparent walls of the Zephyrian laboratory, they could see High Cultivator Xylan and his team beginning their daily observations. Every morning, the aliens would gather at the windows to watch the humans work. They documented everything with their sensors, but never came outside to see the garden up close. Subject: Lisa Carter is engaging in direct soil manipulation for the 4th consecutive day, they heard one of the researchers say through a translation device. Contamination levels must be reaching dangerous concentrations. Lisa ignored them and continued working. She had brought composting materials from the camp's organic waste, carefully building a decomposition system that would feed nutrients back into the soil. It was basic science that any farmer from 1,000 years ago would have understood, but it seemed to fascinate the Zephyrians. The work was hard. The alien soil was packed tight from years of neglect, and breaking it up by hand was slow and tiring. Lisa's back ached and her hands were stained brown, but she felt more hopeful than she had since arriving on this world. By the end of the first week, something miraculous happened. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil in the bean rows. They were small and fragile, but they were alive and growing. Pete whooped with joy when he spotted the first seedlings. Lisa, look, they're coming up. The celebration attracted attention from both camps. Captain Morrison and the other humans gathered around the garden plot, grinning and taking pictures. Even some of the Zephyrians left their laboratory to observe. From a distance, though, they kept their environmental suits sealed. Remarkable, Xylan said, his voice carrying clearly through his suit's speakers. Germination has occurred despite suboptimal soil conditions and primitive cultivation methods. Maybe the methods aren't as primitive as you think, Lisa said. Carefully watering the new seedlings by hand, Xylan's skin color shifted to a thoughtful blue-green. Our analysis indicates that proper germination should require precise chemical balance and sterile growing medium. Your results suggest alternative variables are involved. Lisa stood up and wiped her dirty hands on her work clothes. Life is complicated, Xylan. You can't control every variable, and you shouldn't want to. Plants have been growing for millions of years without perfect conditions. The Zephyrian leader moved closer to the garden's edge, but still maintained several meters of distance. Physical contact with unsterilized organic matter remains inadvisable for our species. Contamination risks are significant. What contamination? Pete asked. We're talking about soil. Your people evolved on this planet. How can touching your own world's dirt be dangerous? Xylan's skin color darkened. Our civilization has evolved beyond such crude necessities. Direct environmental contact is a practice relegated to pre-technological species. Lisa felt a flash of anger. Your pre-technological ancestors managed to keep this planet alive. Your advanced civilization is letting it die? The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the Zephyrian camp. Young researcher Zeph had collapsed while working at one of their analysis stations. His normally bright crystalline skin had faded to a dull gray color, and he was having trouble standing. The Zephyrian medical team rushed to help him, but Lisa could see that Zeph's condition was serious. The artificial food their machines produced was keeping the aliens alive, but it was not providing the complex nutrition their bodies had evolved to need from their own planet's ecosystem. He needs real food, Lisa said quietly to Captain Morrison. Food that grew in this soil, in this atmosphere. Their machines can't replicate the complexity of natural nutrition. Morrison nodded grimly. How long before your garden can produce? Enough to make a difference? Lisa looked at the tiny seedlings emerging from the soil. Weeks, maybe months for a full harvest, but some of the fast-growing greens might be ready sooner. That evening, Lisa worked in her garden by artificial light, extending her day to give the plants more attention. The Zephyrians had offered to provide optimal spectrum growing lights, but she preferred the simple LED panels the humans had brought from Earth. As she worked, she noticed movement in the shadows beyond the camp perimeter. Small creatures were approaching the garden area. They looked like a cross between insects and tiny mammals with iridescent fur that caught the light. Lisa held very still as one of the creatures approached a bean plant and began investigating the leaves. She had not seen any native animal life since arriving on the planet. The Zephyrians had mentioned that most local species had gone extinct as the ecosystem collapsed. The little creature seemed to approve of the bean plant. It settled down near the roots and began doing something that looked like grooming behavior. Lisa realized it was probably helping to aerate the soil around the plant's base. More creatures appeared over the following nights they were drawn to. The garden like travelers finding an oasis in the desert. Lisa began leaving small amounts of compost material around the edges of the plot, and the creatures incorporated into the soil through their natural behavior. The garden is becoming an ecosystem, Pete observed one morning as they watched. A small group of the creatures working among the plants. You're not just growing vegetables. You're bringing this piece of land back to life. The Zephyrians had noticed the wildlife activity too. Their sensors detected the creatures and Xylan made daily observations of their behavior. But the alien leader remained puzzled by what he was seeing. The indigenous fauna appears to be engaging in symbiotic behavior with your cultivated plants. Xylan reported to Lisa during one of their morning conversations. Our records indicate these species have been extinct in this region for over 50 years. Maybe they weren't extinct, Lisa suggested. Maybe they were just waiting for someone to give them a reason to come back. By the end of the second week, the transformation was undeniable. Lisa's small garden plot had become a green island in the barren landscape. The bean plants were climbing improvised trellises made from scavenged materials. Squash vines were spreading across the ground, their broad leaves providing shelter for the native creatures. The fast-growing greens were already large enough that Lisa could begin harvesting small amounts for fresh salads. More importantly, the soil itself was changing. What had been hard and lifeless was becoming soft and rich. Earthworms had appeared from somewhere, processing organic material and creating tunnels that helped water and air reach plant roots. The simple composting system was producing dark, fertile material that smelled like life itself. The contrast with the Zephyrian growing chambers was stark. Despite all their advanced technology and precise environmental controls, their plants continued to struggle and die. The alien scientists could not understand why their theoretically perfect conditions produced inferior results compared to Lisa's simple methods. "There must be variables we have not accounted for," Xylan said during a particularly frustrating day when another batch of their experimental plants failed to thrive. "The human approach appears to incorporate unknown factors." Lisa looked up from where she was harvesting the first mature vegetables from her garden. Her hands were dirty and her clothes were stained, but she was smiling. "The unknown factor is called caring, Xylan. You can't grow life without touching it." The Zephyrian leader stared at the thriving garden through his transparent environmental barrier. His people were slowly starving despite all their technological capabilities, while a small plot of hand-tended vegetables was producing enough fresh food to supplement the human team's diet. For the first time since the mission began, Xylan's absolute confidence in technological superiority seemed to be wavering. The third week brought changes that no one had expected. Lisa Carter's small garden had grown into something that looked like a miracle. Green plants covered the ground where only cracked earth had existed before. The bean vines climbed tall poles and spread their leaves like umbrellas. Squash plants sprawled across the soil, their yellow flowers attracting creatures that had been hiding underground for years. Every morning, Lisa would walk through her garden checking each plant by hand. She could tell from touching a leaf whether a plant needed more water or if insects were problems. Her fingers had learned to read the language of growing things in a way that no machine could match. Pete Williams worked beside her, learning skills that no agricultural school had taught him. He watched Lisa examine soil by smell and taste, determining what nutrients were lacking just by observing how the plants grew. It was knowledge that came from generations of farmers who had worked with their hands. "How do you know that bean plant needs more nitrogen?" Pete asked, watching Lisa examine a vine that looked healthy to his eyes. "See how the older leaves are turning yellow?" Lisa pointed to subtle changes in the plant's appearance. "That's what nitrogen deficiency looks like. The plant is moving nutrients from old leaves to new growth." Pete nodded and made notes in his journal. The Zephyrians had offered to record everything with their advanced monitoring systems, but Lisa preferred the human team to document their methods the old-fashioned way. The success of the garden was impossible to ignore. High cultivator Xylan spent hours each day observing from the safety of his environmental barriers. His team of researchers had filled entire databases with sensor readings, but they still could not explain why the human methods worked better than their technology. "The primitive cultivation approach continues to exceed theoretical yield predictions," Xylan announced to his team during their daily briefing. "Current data suggests efficiency levels that should be impossible under measured conditions." Lisa overheard the conversation through the laboratory's speakers. She smiled and continued harvesting vegetables for the evening meal. The beans were producing more than the human team could eat, and the squash were growing so fast that she had to harvest them. Every other day, the wildlife population around the garden kept expanding. Small flying creatures had appeared, pollinating the squash flowers and controlling insect pests. Burrowing animals helped turn the compost into rich soil. The garden was becoming the center of a growing ecosystem that spread a little farther from the camp. Each day, but the most important change was happening among the Zephyrians themselves. Their health was declining rapidly despite their sophisticated medical technology. Zeth, the youngest researcher, could barely work for more than a few hours before needing rest. Several other team members were showing signs of serious malnutrition. The Crisis came to a head when Dr. Ben Crawford found Zeth collapsed outside the Zephyrian laboratory. The young alien's crystalline skin had turned almost gray, and he was struggling to breathe properly. "Get their medical team," Ben called to Pete. "Something seriously wrong here." The Zephyrian doctors ran their scanner devices over Zeth's unconscious form. The readings showed exactly what Lisa had feared. His body was consuming its own stored nutrients because the artificial food could not provide what he needed. "Nutritional deficiency syndrome," the medical officer reported to Xylan. "His cellular structure is breaking down due to insufficient complex organic compounds." Xylan's skin color shifted through several different hues as he processed this information. "Increase synthetic food production efficiency. Adjust molecular composition to compensate for identified deficiencies." "We have already optimized all parameters," the medical officer replied. "The problem appears to be systemic rather than compositional." Lisa watched the conversation from outside the laboratory. She had been expecting this moment for days. The Zephyrian's machines could create food that looked right and tasted acceptable, but they could not replicate the complex relationships between plants, soil, and living organisms that produced true nutrition. That evening, Captain Morrison approached Xylan with a proposal that surprised everyone. "Lisa has been growing extra vegetables," he said. "Maybe Zeth could try eating some real food instead of the synthetic stuff." Xylan's reaction was immediate and negative. Consumption of unprocessed organic matter would introduce dangerous contamination into Zethian physiology. "The risk of disease transmission is unacceptable." "The risk of starvation seems pretty unacceptable too," Morrison replied. The argument continued for several hours, with Xylan's team presenting data about contamination risks while the humans pointed out that the Zephyrians were dying despite their sterile food supply. Finally, Zeth himself settled the debate. "I want to try the human food," he said weakly from his medical bed. "Our safe methods are killing me slowly. Maybe their dangerous methods will let me live." The next morning, Lisa prepared a simple meal using vegetables from her garden. Fresh beans cooked lightly to preserve their nutrients. Young squash sliced thin and served raw. Leafy greens that had been growing in alien soil under alien suns but somehow tasted like home. Zeth ate slowly, his hands shaking as he held the simple wooden bowl Lisa had carved for him. The other Zephyrians watched with expressions of horror and fascination as their colleague consumed food that had grown in actual dirt. "The flavor profile is unexpectedly complex," Zeth reported after finishing the meal. "Chemical composition appears to include compounds not present in our synthetic alternatives." Within hours, the change in Zeth's condition was obvious. His skin began to regain some of its natural color. His breathing became easier. For the first time in weeks, he was able to work for a full day without collapsing. The success created a crisis within the Zephyrian team. Their leader's absolute belief in technological superiority was being challenged by results they could not deny. Xylan stood at the edge of Lisa's garden every day, watching her work with an expression that seemed caught between curiosity and revulsion. "Your methods produce outcomes that contradict established principles," Xylan said to Lisa during one of their daily conversations. "Direct soil contact should result in contamination and reduced efficiency. Instead, it appears to enhance productivity." Lisa looked up from where she was training bean vines to climb their support poles. "Maybe your established principles are wrong." "Principles based on comprehensive scientific analysis cannot be incorrect," Xylan insisted, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Science is supposed to change when new evidence comes along," Lisa said. "That's how you learn things." That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. Xylan approached the garden's boundary and stood there for a long time, staring at the rich soil and healthy plants. His environmental suit's sensors were recording everything, but for once he seemed more interested in simply observing than in collecting data. "The indigenous organisms appear to be thriving in symbiosis with your cultivated species," he said finally. "Our records indicate this level of biodiversity has not existed in this region for decades." "Life wants to come back," Lisa said simply. You just have to give it a chance. Xylan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note Lisa had never heard from him before. It sounded almost like longing. My ancestors grew food in this soil, he said. Before we developed technological alternatives, my people worked directly with the growing medium. Our historical records describe it as fulfilling work. What happened? Lisa asked. We evolved beyond such primitive necessities, Xylan replied, but the words sounded hollow. We believed that advancement meant eliminating inefficient biological dependencies. Lisa continued working as she talked, her hands moving automatically through tasks that had become routine. Maybe advancement means learning to work with biology instead of against it. That evening, Zeth joined the humans for dinner. He sat carefully on one of their simple chairs, still weak but clearly improving. The meal consisted entirely of vegetables from Lisa's garden, prepared in the style his people had used before their technological revolution. I remember these flavors from childhood, Zeth said quietly. My grandmother used to grow food like this before the great conversion to synthetic production. The other Zephyrians listened to this admission with shock. Food cultivation had been considered so primitive that most of them had never learned about their own agricultural history. The evening ended. Xylan made an announcement that surprised everyone. Tomorrow I will be conducting personal observations of the human cultivation methods. Direct examination of the growing process may provide insights that remote monitoring has missed. It was the first time since the mission began that the high cultivator had expressed interest in getting close to actual soil. The change represented a crack in the wall of Zephyrian technological pride that had seemed unbreakable just days before. Lisa smiled as she cleaned up after dinner. Tomorrow, she might finally have a chance to show these advanced aliens that sometimes the oldest ways were also the best ways. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Lisa Carter walked out to her garden before dawn, carrying her simple tools and a cup of coffee made from earth beans. She had been working this small plot of alien soil for over a month now, and it had become more productive than anyone had imagined possible, but today was different. High Cultivator Xylan was waiting at the garden's edge, still wearing his environmental suit but standing closer to the growing plants than he had ever dared before. His crystalline skin showed colors Lisa had never seen, shifting between blue and green in patterns that seemed to indicate deep uncertainty. Good morning, Xylan, Lisa said, setting down her coffee and picking up a simple hand tool. Ready to learn how to get your hands dirty? The Zephyrian leader stood motionless for a long moment. Around them, the garden was waking up with the rising suns. Small native creatures scurried between the plants, and flying insects moved from flower to flower. The whole area hummed with life that had not existed here for decades. My people believe that direct contact with unprocessed soil indicates evolutionary regression, Xylan said finally. But watching your success has made me question long-held assumptions. Lisa knelt down and picked up a handful of rich, dark earth. It was completely different from the sterile, lifeless dirt that had been here when they arrived. Months of composting, careful watering, and natural biological processes had transformed it into something that could support abundant life. Want to feel what healthy soil is like? She offered, holding out her dirt-stained hand. Xylan stared at the offered soil for a full minute. Then slowly he began removing his environmental suit's gloves. His hands were long and elegant, with skin that looked like colored glass. They had never touched natural earth. When Xylan's bare fingers made contact with the soil, his whole body went rigid. His skin flashed through a rapid sequence of colors, and Lisa worried that she had made a terrible mistake. But then he relaxed, and his expression changed to something like wonder. It's warm, he said in amazement, and I can sense thousands of microorganisms working in harmony. There are chemical processes occurring that our scanners never detected. That's because your scanners were looking for individual components, Lisa explained. But soil isn't just chemistry. It's a living system where everything works together. Pete Williams approached carrying a tray of breakfast for both teams. Over the past weeks, more and more Zephyrians had begun eating food from the garden. Their Health had improved dramatically, and several were now helping with simple tasks like watering and harvesting. Zeth wants to know if you'll teach him how to plant seeds, Pete told Lisa. He says his grandmother would have known how, but the knowledge was lost when they switched to synthetic food production. Lisa smiled. Of course. The more hands we have, the more we can grow. The transformation accelerated rapidly after that morning. Xylan's decision to touch actual soil had symbolic importance for his people that Lisa was only beginning to understand. If their leader could abandon the taboos against manual labor, other Zephyrians felt free to do the same. Within days, a group of young Zephyrian researchers had joined the garden project. They brought their species' natural precision and attention to detail, but now applied these skills to reading plant needs rather than operating machines. Zeth proved especially gifted at understanding the complex relationships between different plants growing together. Companion planting? Lisa explained as she showed Zeth how beans could provide nitrogen for squash, while squash leaves could shade the soil around bean roots. Each plant helps the others grow better. The Zephyrians were fascinated by these natural partnerships. Their technology had always focused on controlling and optimizing individual elements, but they had never considered that cooperation might be more effective than domination. The garden expanded beyond the original plot as more team members from both species joined the effort. Using Zephyrian construction techniques guided by human agricultural wisdom, they created terraced growing areas that made efficient use of water and space. But unlike the sterile growing chambers in the laboratory, these new areas were designed to work with natural processes rather than against them. The breakthrough came when they discovered native Zephyrian plants that had been considered extinct. Seeds had been lying dormant in the soil, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. As the ecosystem around the garden recovered, these ancient varieties began to sprout. These are vegetables my great-grandmother described in her journals, Xylan said, examining a strange purple plant that looked like a cross between corn and bamboo. Our historical records mention them, but we assumed they were lost forever. Lisa helped him harvest the mature specimens carefully, saving seeds for future planting. Nothing's ever really lost if the seeds survive. Plants are patient. They can wait decades or even centuries for their chance to grow again. The first major harvest celebration brought both teams together for a feast unlike anything that had happened since the mission began. Tables were set up in the garden itself, surrounded by the thriving plants that had produced their food. Humans and Zephyrians sat together, sharing dishes prepared from vegetables that had grown in alien soil under alien suns. Captain Morrison looked around at the scene with satisfaction. A month ago, I wasn't sure this mission would work at all. Now look at what we've accomplished. The transformation went far beyond just growing food. The Zephyrians had rediscovered knowledge their species had lost in their rush toward technological advancement. They learned to read weather patterns by observing clouds and wind. They developed an intuitive understanding of plant health that no scanner could provide. Most importantly, they remembered the satisfaction that came from creating life instead of just controlling it. Xylan stood to address both teams as the celebration continued into the evening. His skin showed colors that Lisa had learned indicated deep contentment and gratitude. We believe that evolution meant leaving behind what we considered primitive practices, he said. We have learned that true advancement means integrating ancient wisdom with modern capabilities. The Garden Project became the foundation for a larger restoration effort. Teams of humans and Zephyrians worked together to establish growing areas across the planet. They combined Earth's agricultural knowledge with Zephyrian technology to create systems that were both highly productive and environmentally sustainable. The success attracted attention from other regions of the planet. Zephyrian communities that had been struggling with food production sent representatives to learn the new techniques. The concept of hands-on agriculture spread like seeds on the wind. Lisa found herself teaching classes to groups of young Zephyrians who wanted to learn traditional farming methods their grandparents had known. She showed them how to read soil conditions by touch, how to identify plant diseases by observing leaf patterns, and how to work with natural cycles instead of fighting them. "The most important tool you have is your hands," she told one group of eager students. "Machines can measure and analyze, but they can't feel what plants need. That takes practice and patience." The mission that had begun as a simple agricultural exchange had become something much more significant. Two species had learned to combine their strengths, creating solutions that neither could have achieved alone. The Zephyrians provided technological precision and the humans contributed intuitive understanding. But the real breakthrough came from working together. As the growing season progressed, the transformed landscape around the camp became a demonstration of what was possible when technology served life instead of replacing it. The barren ground had become productive farmland. Native species had returned to areas where they had been absent for generations. Most importantly, the Zephyrians had reconnected with their own planet in ways their recent ancestors would have recognized. Pete Williams stood with Lisa one evening, looking out over the expanded gardens that now covered several hectares around the camp. The twin suns were setting, casting purple light over green plants and dark soil. "Think they'll remember this after we leave?" Pete asked. Lisa smiled and picked up a handful of soil, letting it run through her fingers. It was rich and, alive, full of the microorganisms and organic matter that made plant life possible. "They'll remember because it's in their hands now. Once you learn to feel soil this way, you never forget." The seeds Lisa had planted had indeed fed the whole camp, but more importantly, they had planted the seeds of understanding between two civilizations. The lesson was simple but profound. Life grows best when nurtured by hands willing to get dirty in its service, and the most advanced solutions often grow from the oldest wisdom. The garden would continue to flourish long after the human team returned to Earth, tended by Zephyrian hands that had learned to touch their own world with love instead of controlling it with machines. And in that ongoing care, both species had found something more valuable than food. They had discovered the foundation of all growth, all life, and all hope for the future.